Good afternoon if you're in Europe, good morning if you're in the US, and if you're in Asia, good evening, and thank you very much for being with us. My name is Geoff Dyer. I'm a senior editor here at the Financial Times in London, and I'm your host for this fascinating digital dialogue on how business leaders can capitalize on disruption, which the FT is presenting together with AlixPartners, the global consultancy firm. I think we can all agree there's certainly no shortage of disruption around. We used to think of the idea of disruption as being something just purely about technology, but then we had a pandemic that shut down a large part of the global economy. We've had a series of rolling supply chain crises that have just affected industry all around the world. We now have a war in Europe, a severe energy crisis that's threatening business and consumers all across the continent. And if you happen to be in Britain today, then it turns out there's just a little bit of politics going on as well. But before I introduce the speakers, and we have a fantastic panel to talk about these issues today, I just want to quickly explain the format for this event. In the first section, our four speakers are each going to make brief introductory remarks on just how they think companies and executives should manage disruption. And they bring together a broad range of different experiences from energy to transport to retail to talk about these issues. And then in the second half, we will open it up the floor to you. So please do send in your questions if you have any, and we will do our very best to answer them in the best manner we can. So to our first panelist, I'm going to invite Simon Freakley, who's the Chief Executive of Alix Partners, to speak. Simon, if you could just briefly tell the audience a little bit about your background experience, and then tell us, you're speaking to chief executives of companies around the world the whole time. How do you see all these different disruptive forces playing out and these companies reacting to them?
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. It's a pleasure to be with you. For those of you who don't know Alix Partners, we're a global consulting company, business consulting company. So we're speaking to major corporates around the world all the time. And Geoff, just to underline a point you've just made, disruption really is top of mind for everyone. We realized a number of years ago that so many of the things we were advising our corporate clients on were actually the effect of disruptions in their markets and geographies. And so we decided to study it formally. So for the last few years, we've been doing a disruption insights piece of work to really understand what's at play. And as you said, Geoff, there are multiple disruptions happening. In our last survey done earlier this year, we interviewed 3,000 senior executives around the world in 8 industries in 9 major geographies to find out what was top of mind for them. What screamed out from that survey was that disruption was the #1 worry for every senior executive in all of those industries and markets. But some other insights came out of this too. When we asked them for their top 10 specific worries, COVID, interestingly enough, came in at number 13, didn't even make the top 10. The effect of artificial intelligence on their industry as a disruptor was key in a broader context of technology, climate change, energy, so many disruptions. And of course, these disruptions don't act in isolation. They buffet against each other, turning a rolling sea into a choppy sea. We also found out from our survey, 94% of these 3,000 senior executives said that they felt that their current business model would not survive more than 3 years. They had to reinvent themselves to be relevant. Interestingly enough, 72% of these senior executives said they feared losing their jobs because of the disruption. Those two statistics, of course, may not be unrelated. But disruption is the #1 challenge for senior executives. And in so many ways, of course, we're seeing it. So this was the central theme coming out of our research, Geoff, and absolutely bears out the conversations we're having every day with our clients.
Thank you very much for that, Simon. If I could then turn to Deanna Jones, the Chief Human Resources Officer at Baker Hughes, energy technology company. Deanna, talk to us a little bit about how digitization is transforming the energy sector.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. I'm really honored to be here today and be able to talk about this. So just to give a little bit of context, right? So Baker Hughes, an energy technology company, we span 120 countries around the globe, and we look at energy services through a lot of different lenses as it relates to the manufacturing of products and delivering technology. And, you know, we referenced the pandemic. You know, one of the things that we saw during that period of time is we've had a lot of opportunity to actually disrupt through digital technologies and do things differently in the way that we work in the energy industry. But the adoption of that technology at times, you know, has been very slow because it requires a lot of different ways of working. And so the pandemic, you know, we really leaned into, and a lot of our customers actually adopted, you know, so we went from, you know, about 60% of our clients doing, for example, remote drilling pre-pandemic to over 90% of clients actually adopting that type of digitization and technology. So, you know, we're on a journey, our customers are on a journey. We know that efficiency is actually one of the key components of achieving that net zero future that we're all leaning into, and that a number of the technologies that need to be developed out into the future have not yet even been started to be conceptualized. So, you know, we're using that digitization personally to transform our operations and improve productivity and efficiency across our company, which then allows us to provide those proof points back into our customers so that they can create more efficient ecosystems, you know, using products and services, using AI to make better, faster decisions, really enabling and improving asset health and productivity. You know, it's a very machine-rich environment that we operate inside of energy, and you know, really delivering these capabilities today, not only through our domain experience inside of the energy industry, but also leveraging partnerships across industry and creating capabilities, you know, with companies like Microsoft and AWS, C3 AI. There's no way that within an industry like the energy industry that we can create all of those capabilities in-house. And so I really think partnerships and changing the way that we work to solve some of these complex problems across the ecosystem is absolutely essential for us. So that's, you know, for us, really how the digital revolution is showing up in the energy industry. I'll go back to efficiency being a key part of how we achieve net zero. There's no way to get to efficiency without digital disruption.
Thank you very much, Deanna. And next panelist is Richard Corbridge, the Chief Information Officer at Boots. Richard, if you could talk to us a little bit about e-commerce and just how innovative has Boots had to be in order to prosper in such a cutthroat market as e-commerce?
Thanks, Geoff, and hello, everybody. I think not just Boots, but retail more generally has had to really embrace and move really quickly during the pandemic to make sure that digital and our ability to continue to serve our customers, to put our customers right at the center of everything they do and want from them has been a really core part to that. And there are a number of different parallels where we've tried to use data to personalize journeys on a digital level rather than using our colleagues in store to personalize the journeys. As we now start to get whatever normal looks like in the UK back to some form of reality, you start to see a real acceptance now of retail being very much disrupted by digital. But we're also seeing customers and in our case, patients, really wanting to have that digital experience in store as well as at home, as well as on the bus into work, as well as in many other places. So that much talked about omni-channel or sort of unified commerce capability becoming the next thing really that digital is already disrupting from a commerce point of view. And that, I think, is becoming really, really a big part of where we go now, trying to unify the ability for patients and customers to interact with us and always putting them at the center of what we do.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Rich. And if I could ask you, if you do want to send in questions, please do send them in before we get to our final of our four panelists. I should say we've been introducing them in alphabetical order of the companies. There's no particular hierarchy or seniority here. So finally, but not less, is Dimitris Bountolos, who's the Chief Information and Innovation Officer at Ferrovial, the transport company. Dimitris, tell us what sort of impact you see from technology in reshaping transport and infrastructure over the next decade or so.
Hello, everyone. Really honored to be with you here. Just for you that probably don't know or don't recognize Ferrovial, we are one of the largest infrastructure player with quite a unique role because we are covering the entire value chain from the typical process of developing an infrastructure, from the conceptualization of an idea to the design, operation, construction, and before. And typically we have like long-term perspective because many of those assets require 50, 60, 70 years of perspective. No, so typically we were interacting with atoms. We were pushing the atoms to the limits, creating shapes and forms in a stable way. And right now, bits are more critical in order to take the proper decision. No? We are identified that for many purposes, the enhancing of the decisions using machine learning, using AI, using advanced analytics has become the core of our group and many other meta groups. Yes, not because the necessity of improve in terms of efficiency the decisions, no, or to reduce the risk or to gain competitiveness. Thinking in growth and thinking in the diversification, it's crucial. No? And we started years ago trying to anticipate that wave with typical dynamic, no, like automation of the tax, incorporation of advanced capabilities. And right now, what we have seen is the last years, AI and machine learning are modifying completely the landscape. In an uncertainty environment, that is forcing us, in particular, we are adopting continuously in order to tackle that uncertainty scenarios planning, where are trying to stress the potential variation of many of the decisions in order to identify central corridors where we will be able to apply technology in order to improve many of the processes. All stages of a typical construction company or large infrastructure group are able to be enhanced with the adoption of advanced technologies that years before were not addressed to that particular sector. No? When we talk about Industry 4.0, construction and infrastructure is living more or less the same revolution, where the adoption of 5G and the adoption of high connectivity, and in particular in transport, the trends where the electrification and up to the generation of energy are changing completely dynamic, are elements that we are introducing in our daily decision, infused with the latest technology and changing roles, jobs for profiles that never were imagined 5 years ago. No, so critical moment.
Fascinating, Dimitris. Thanks so much. What can you just give our listeners just one example? You talked a lot about how AI is impacting right across the different range of your businesses. Can you give us one kind of concrete example of just how that's playing out in practice and the way that you are using AI on a particular technology or on a particular sector?
Yeah.
Or a particular...
We have a lot of, let me give you an example, transmission lines. Every time we need to design a new transmission line in the middle of the jungle in South America or in Asia, 500 kilometers, where typically 30% of the cost could be the towers, to introduce automatic AI models that are using all the variables to improve the design of the tower could have a meaningful impact in the cost of the steel, in the allocation of the towers. And that before had several iterations with hundreds of engineers using computed system. Right now with AI, we are able to extrapolate that to thousands of iterations that reduce 2%, 3%, 5% of the total consumption of steel. That this is transferred to the cost, is transferred to the supply chain, and is run by those techniques. No? Another could be the revision of the rail tracks, the automatic revision of the rail tracks in order to identify if we have any kind of interference. We are using a computed aid system that are scanning the rail track, identify any anomaly, and in live bringing alerts. That will take years ago weeks, and we are able to do that in a matter of hours across the entire network, in particular in the high-speed train network in Spain. No? Forecast of water. We are able to infuse AI models in order to, in all of our water plants, have a long-term, medium-term forecast based in hundreds of variables that we'll be able to use that limited resource in a much more proper way. No?
Simon, you also mentioned in your remarks that you see AI as being one of the things that the executives you're talking to are most concerned about, interested and focused in. Could you just give us a couple of examples of the most striking examples you've seen about how AI is impacting and is being used in companies that you're talking to?
Well, Thank you, Geoff. One of the big challenges, of course, for many CEOs around the world and senior executives is that they're not digital natives. You know, generationally, they are not digital natives, and so as fast as possible, they're trying to raise their own digital IQ to be sufficiently digitally fluent to really understand what in their markets and geographies are necessary for them to stay ahead of the pace. But let me give you an example. One of the panel touched on supply chain challenges, you know, obviously with profound disruptions, not just Ukraine, but, you know, the sanctions around the world and the effect of COVID. How do people source their goods, necessary goods, to be able to keep their production on track? Well, of course, one of the challenges is that everybody has focused on their global supply chains to have the lowest cost supply and just-in-time delivery. Well, of course, now it's not just in time, it's also just in case. What happens if the supply chains break down? People have to have not just global options, but regional options for supply chain sourcing and also local options. So to your question, how to use AI to do that? One of the things that we saw one of our clients do very recently was to take all of the import data in the US as it related to the products they needed. It was an auto manufacturer, and using artificial intelligence tools, business machine learning, analyze all of the input data to understand which factories around the world were sending those products into the US, and by triangulating data work out which factories, not just which countries, which factories and which regions in which countries were likely to have surplus capacity for them to lock in to make sure they had this just-in-case supply chain optionality. And that was a great example of using the digital data that was available from import, the data lake facility that they had, and then artificial intelligence tools to analyze that data literally in a matter of days to understand how they always had optionality to keep their own production going.
Thank you very much for that. I'm going to turn some questions from the audience, if I may. One is, first question we've got is asking just about the impact of some of these technologies is going to have on jobs. I wonder if I could first send that to you, Rich. Boots is obviously a substantial employer of people around the country, but at the same time, you say you are moving a lot more into e-commerce and introducing a lot of these different types of technologies in the way you do business. Just what sort of impact is that having on the numbers and types of people that you're employing?
And I think everybody across the world, if you listen to any of the media, has the sort of war on talent type challenge right now across all types of digital jobs. So I think it's having a very positive impact in that there are lots of jobs and lots of interesting areas to go into, to look at. I think what we've tried to do is that professionalization of technology roles that will then allow people to stretch themselves in their career across the different parts of digital, data, and technology. So it's almost flattened the towers that did exist previously around having data, having technology, having digital there. So I think that's a good thing for colleagues that are in for the long-term career, wanting able to do that, but also for sort of new grads, people moving into the job market, to be able to not have to decide now which tower of the width of technology, data, and digital they want to obsess about, but actually to be able to move between those. When we look at the job market itself, though, the ability to recruit just gets harder. The salaries just go up, and our ability to retain is becoming more complex. We're having to really try harder and harder and harder to come up with different means and methods to retain colleagues into our organization that is never just to do with salary. And I think that's really fascinating now. It is that the organization's value proposition to our colleagues in digital is just as important as the salary we can match.
I'm going to turn the same question to you, Diana. Are you seeing the impact of technology in your business creating more jobs, fewer jobs, better jobs, or worse jobs, or all of the above?
Maybe a little bit of all of the above. And I love the way that Rich was, sort of characterizing the things that have changed. So first of all, I think we think of digital as a capability that we're building in everyone in the work that they do. So we were talking before about, a lot of leaders not being digital natives and knowing how this would disrupt the way that we do work. And so really embedding that piece. But I think it changes the jobs. We were just having a conversation last week about that there's always this fear of elimination, and certainly the type of roles changes and shifts. But what it does is create a lot of opportunity. And I like what Rich said about, it comes back to sort of culture and purpose in the company that you're in. And that is a compelling reason for people to want to come into and work inside of an industry and really think about things differently. So if I think about inside the energy space, the embracing a net zero future, there's a lot of digital talents that want to be part of that, maybe not for the entirety of their career, but they want to come and use the capabilities that they have. And then I go back again, sort of to the partnerships. How do we take domain in different industries and partner that up with people with specialized skills and some of the more nuanced pieces of how you create, digital technologies, and putting those two things together, right? So I think it's a win-win. But we spend a lot of time, and we're having a lot of discussions really about how do you move from job-based to skills-based development of talent, so that you really know how you can reskill and multi-skill your own workforce as we go through these disruptions, and how people know that they can then apply those skills in any instance, in any industry, if their industry is disrupted to an extent that they need to move or shift around. So I think that just again, to me, sort of creating a broader capability in this space. And for us, I would say it's, how do you attract more of the younger talents into this type of work versus maybe some of the other areas that they've developed. How do you take someone who, for example, started in psychology and say, hey, like, it would be great if you can also create a capability around data and analytics. Sometimes sort of balancing those two things, I think, is a big challenge for us in our industry as well as other industries.
Please do keep the questions coming in if you have them. We talked a little bit already about the impact of AI. One of our listeners wants to ask about what the impact might be of quantum computing and disrupting business. Dimitris, do you have any thoughts on that? Do you see any impact in your area?
Well, quantum, we have been talking about quantum capabilities and development for many years, and visualizing like an exotic type of technology that never will become mainstream. And the truth is, we are starting to anticipate use cases and model of adoption where dramatically the implementation of quantum capabilities could disrupt many business. One that has generated a lot of attention is obviously cryptography and the defensibility of passwords in extent, and the relation of that capability with the cyber attacks. Everybody's really alert about how we could use from the good side and how the other side could use for the bad side the quantum capability to destroy the type of security that we have right now. Another type of benefit that we are trying to anticipate is the simultaneous computing of billion of points, billion of formulas or processes at the same time for dynamics that will require just a matter of milliseconds, monitoring of specific assets or the resolution of high complex scenarios will be dramatically reduced to a matter of seconds. That is going to change completely how to approach problems, how to stress different solutions in terms of chemistry, in terms of dynamic of the water, in terms of even potential catastrophes like floods, and even forecasts of the weather and so on. And we are seeing how in the next 5-10 years, we are going to progressively adopt quantum capabilities mainstream in many of the sectors, as we have done with AI and many other technologies.
Fascinating, thank you. We have another question from the audience on a different technology. Someone asking what people think the impact might be of blockchains, and particularly around all the technologies that have been developed and what's sometimes called Web 3.0. I don't know if anyone has any views on that. Simon or Dimitris, Rich, would you like to have a stab at blockchain?
Just a quick view, and then definitely jump to Simon or Deanna or anybody else. I think the two things we're seeing the blockchain really interestingly applied to, one is in clinical research, where by using the blockchain, you're leaving the clinical data, genomic sequencing, some really important information, but you're leaving it owned by the patient who wants to offer that information into clinical research and be recruited and use their data in trials, which I think has been, so I sit on a non-exec board in Ireland where they're doing that now, and it's fascinating the speed they can recruit patients because they see themselves as owning their data still and being able to decide on a piece of data by piece of data basis how to deliver that into clinical research. And then the other thing that we've been looking at is using blockchain for sustainability, or at least to allow customers to track sustainability of product all the way back to its origin. So allowing that to become the data-based solution that allows you to track all the way through as a customer at a shelf edge or online, the actual true sustainability of products that have those claims on them. So two really different and interesting areas that we've seen that start to come to life.
Thank you very much for that. I have a question specifically for Simon. I wonder if you talk a little bit about one of our audience is asking about what sort of proactive steps that companies can take to manage, to minimize, to deal with some of the risks from these disruptions that they're facing. Well, how can they get on the front foot?
Thank you. Well, I think one of the themes that's arisen from our own work and research, Geoff, is that actually disrupting ourselves before others do it to us is probably one of the most important things we do. And if we think about the responses I mentioned earlier to our survey, 94% of the 3,000 senior executives felt that their business models wouldn't last for more than 3 years. Actually getting right on the front foot, leaning in, pace over perfection, if you like, to look at what a reimagined business model looks like. So I think proactivity in disrupting oneself is critical in this. And so to state the obvious, remaining agile, because it's not just one recreation. There's going to be constant recreation of our businesses, our business models, how we go to market, how we think about pricing, for instance, in our markets, where our customer base is moving to in terms of their preferences. So agility is absolutely key. Disrupting ourselves before others do it to it, I would say, is the main lesson that comes out of this. And then one final point on this is we talk a lot about, of course, as we have this morning, about the risks of disruption. What we shouldn't lose track of is that there's more opportunity in disruption than there is risk. Actually, the opportunities created by new technologies, by shifting markets, mean that in pivoting our business models, there's lots of opportunity for our company, whilst we also mitigate the risks that these disruptions pose.
Deanna, do you see it that way? Do you think companies should think of it much more in terms of opportunity rather than risks when we're talking about all these different disruptive forces?
Yeah, absolutely. As Simon was talking, I was thinking about the way that we've, been working on creating sort of a differential leadership model where we see, sort of the analysis of people that are performative leaders, right, where they're capable of managing and dealing with risk, managing scale, making sure that they're taking care of sort of your base businesses, but also identifying the traits that create, if we would call them transformative leaders, where, to Simon's point, they lean into that disruption. They're looking specifically to anticipate those trends, creating, agile environments, bold decisions, being comfortable with, ambiguity and failure as learning as opposed to failure as a fatal flaw, and, making sure that we're instilling that in leaders as we're growing and developing them in the business, almost, if you will, creating a startup mentality inside a corporate ecosystem to the extent that you can. And I think the more that we can identify those traits and behaviors early, the more that we can encourage them and actually create a broader leadership environment where people feel comfortable in both of those places.
Geoff, could I build on a point that Deanna just made?
Please do, yes.
This whole notion of transformative leadership, transformative leaders, Deanna, I think is so important, particularly during these profoundly disrupted times. You think, well, what does that take? Well, clearly, leaders have to be able to articulate the purpose of their organization, why what they do, the organization does, matters. But also, what we found is that leaders have to be their own chief communication officers. They have to be able to explain why what they're doing is important, why the transformation that they are igniting is necessary in the furtherance of the company's objectives, and why that's purposeful. So I think, Deanna, you're absolutely right. This whole idea of transformational leaders driving the necessary change and leaning into this is critically important.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've, talked about the fact that, in that communication, sort of the transparency and the humility around the fact that we don't have all the answers, right? And that we are in an iterative moment, where we think maybe we have 60% certainty or 80% certainty, and we're going to figure out the other incremental pieces very quickly as we go along together, that we have the capabilities to solve the problems, as opposed to the problems already solved and I'm going to be directive about what I'm doing. I think, that's a critical part when I think about, everyone talking about the technologies that have been deployed. That's really, what we're doing in the disruption is, leaning into that uncertainty and then leaning towards, a very certain outcome.
Another question from our audience, which I think is always just a great question to ask people who run big businesses. The question is, which is more important, product innovation or operational optimization? So I guess the issue is, I'll turn to you, Dimitris. When you're running a big organization, should be worried more about doing things that are new, or doing the things you do already to do them better? Which is the bigger priority?
In my case, due to my role, information and innovation, I have divided the brain in two hemispheres. One is fully attached to running the operation, and the other to bring ideas without creating shortcuts into the middle. That's what typically it's happening in large organizations that try to be ambidextrous, try to manage simultaneously what is bringing revenues, at the same time anticipate the new source of revenues, the new diversified opportunities. And that's one of the more critical problems. We are not the code typically to explore, to iterate, to experiment, because we are more or less engine to gain efficiency over the running business, and to introduce both capabilities at the same time and transversally expand that risk-averse approach even to the existing line of business. It's really, really important. We practically have decided that the company have to adopt that spirit and flavor, iteration, agility, exploration, open ecosystem, in order to, in a humble way, recognize that the answers to the uncertainty could be outside more than ever. It's something that has to be deployed at the scale, and the leaders that have to be spread all over the company require that perspective. They don't have the answers, but they believe in the vision, and they know the techniques, the tools, and those type of skills in order to orchestrate transversally outside the company the way to iterate, capturing opportunities that are not evident, at the same time introduce those capabilities into the daily operation to improve the efficiency with the latest technology. Otherwise, we are dividing the company into realities and splitting those that are looking forward and those that are remaining into the past. That is creating in many large organizations like two-speed type of company. We need to gain a growing average speed, breaking the brackets and creating a common path where the drivers will have to be the same. We call it central corridor. It's not optimal, but it's trying to gather the benefit from both sides.
And Rich, same question to you. How do you find the balance between trying to do new things and trying to do things better?
I think we're heading to a place where that is innovative. That is the disruption if you can do both. I think that's what I find fascinating now. There isn't lots of new technology that's really going to break ground. It's more about how do you connect to the technology that's there in a way that delights the customer, satisfies a colleague, and delivers the things that you need to do. So, that run first mentality has to be there, particularly in retail when you've got so many customers and you're trying to make sure that every moment you can still give every customer what they want. But actually being able to run first and then overlay the new technology on top of it to be additive to the experience is probably the most disruptive thing we can actually try and do right now. And it's really hard to get right as well, because your exec, your colleagues, your team, your organization is more obsessed with making sure that tomorrow works than they are with making sure 6 months from now works in the most part. And therefore, you've got to do that sales pitch that both Simon and Deanna talked about as well, to make sure that people can see the future as well as be clear that tomorrow is going to work as it should do.
Open to another question from our audience, which gets, I think, to the whole war on talent that several of you have been talking about. Is it more realistic for a company facing these kinds of disruptions? I'm going to ask this to you, Deanna. When you're facing this kind of disruptive forces, is it more realistic to think about hiring outside to bring in the energy and ideas to deal with it? Or should you be focused more on reskilling and training up the people you have to be able to adapt to these kind of challenges? How should you be thinking about it from an employment point of view?
Yeah, so I like Rich's point about sort of this, to me, is another one of those two-speed questions. So I think you have to bring in outside expertise to encourage the view and for people to see what that disruption actually looks like. So if your culture doesn't already have that kind of sentiment of constant disruption and sort of leaning into the change, you need to bring some of those change agents inside the organization so that everyone can say, oh, okay, that's what it looks like. That's what the expectation is of what we're doing. But the reskilling and the upskilling of your own resources that are already inside the company, people who know how to navigate, you know, all of the things that you've already established and can actually help you then drive change at pace. To me, those two things are absolutely essential in equal portions, or, you know, as a company, you decide which portions, you know, is it 70% reskilling and 30% external hiring? But I think both are essential. And in my experience in HR, typically the external hiring comes first, which worries people about the fact that you actually have the commitment to the reskilling or the upskilling. But it just takes a little bit more time sometimes to build that engine, to know exactly what you need to do to create more of those disruptors inside the organization.
As another fantastic question for the audience, which I'm going to ask everyone to respond to, but we'll try and do it briefly. So let's have a quick fire round on this particular question, which is, which technologies are you all particularly bullish about in your respective markets at the moment? Maybe Simon, if I can open that one with you, which technologies are you seeing that you think your clients and your companies are particularly excited about at the moment?
I think that there was a question earlier on blockchain. I think that blockchain is the future. I think digital currency is the future now. Whether Bitcoin or Ethereum or any of the others will dominate, we'll see in due course. But I think if we look, say, 25 years out, the world is going to be run on blockchain and we'll all be using digital currency. Whether that happens in 10 years' time or 12 years' time or 15 years' time, it's going to happen in that time scale. So we're seeing a lot of activity about really understanding what that offers by way of opportunity to our clients and to ourselves. So I would say that's a real focus at the moment.
Rich, over to you quickly.
Yeah, I think computer vision in retail for us, it's not just about removing that friction of checkout, etc. It's turning stores into an analytics capability that allows you to really understand where customers are moving, looking, doing, touching in a store, and therefore really range in the right way to give everybody what they need and want.
Dimitris, over to you.
In our case, I would say to digitalize the infrastructure, the physical asset, creating digital twins, which is a concept that is the anticipated entrance door of the infraverse/metaverse, have a digital copy of the reality, put sensor on top with a lot of IoT. We are seeing that increasing exponentially. Sensing the reality in order to orchestrate the reality in a more efficient way, and in particular in linear infrastructure, towards to more efficient operation in order to increase the capacity without expanding the footprint and with much more sensible operation in terms of sustainability. That is a linear trending topic that we are foreseeing exponentially growing in the next decade.
And Deanna, in your sector, are there any particular technologies you think that your company and your are very bullish on?
Yeah, so I would give two. So I think we've spoken to sort of the platform element of how do you, create an environment where you're working horizontally and plugging in all of the things that you've already created so that you're using data seamlessly across, very complex plant or rig-based operations so that you're making better and more efficient decisions. I think when you do that, when we think about sort of the productivity of wells, and if you increase that by 1 or 2%, that has a material impact on sustainability and the amount of, carbon infrastructure that we're operating on. So that would be one. And then I would say, sort of outside the digital realm, I think the movement and the distinction of gases in the hydrogen environment, I think there's a lot of opportunity there to do things in a much cleaner and different way, inclusive of, sort of the transportation of gases. And so there's some exciting technologies that are in that space as well. How we think about, sort of energy to power.
Thank you all for that. That was fascinating. We're coming close to the end of our time, but one final question I'm going to try and throw Simon's way. You talked a little bit about this when you discussed the impact of AI, but one of our audience wants to know about just how can organizations track particularly sustainability through their supply chains? Are there particular data sources or ways that they can do that to really feel that they can get on top of the sustainability of the goods that they're bringing?
It's such a great question, Geoff, because not only, of course, do we all have to demonstrate our commitment to sustainability, not just because of ESG requirements if we're public companies, but just demonstrating to our customers, our employees, our broader stakeholders, our commitment to the E of the ESG. And of course, there are technologies available to help do that. But of course, these things don't operate just in isolation. I'll give you an example. One of our clients, a big consumer products company, global company, absolutely wanted to improve its sustainability credentials and to be able to demonstrate that to its stakeholder groups. But also, of course, it was trying to maintain margin. So how could they improve sustainability and evidence it on the one hand, but also keep a focus on margin? So what we all focused on together was how to mitigate waste in the packaging process of their products, because in mitigating waste, we did improve their sustainability credentials. We also helped keep a focus on margin. What that example demonstrates to me is that actually driving better sustainability outcomes is not at odds with running a good business, but we have to be able to capture and demonstrate both.
And I wonder, Rich, whether you have any thoughts on that, whether there are things that you had to think about in your own company in terms of how you look at sustainability and what you're seeing through the supply chain?
I mean, absolutely. As Simon said, every business is having to and must do. It's a part of our duty, isn't it, to be looking at that from a major retailer with a lot of stores across the country. We've focused very much on the physicality of sustainability in stores first, and are only now, in some ways, sadly, only now coming to the digital side of what does that bring and change. But it's an exciting prospect, and it's one that is definitely affirmative to brand, isn't it? As you start to explain to people, customers, patients, why and what we're doing in that space, it becomes really an interesting way to appeal.
To just, Rich, well, you pick up on something you mentioned earlier about now that we've come out of the pandemic, and you saw obviously huge changes in the way that customers behaved and shopped during the pandemic, but now we've gone back to something approaching a new normal. What does that actually mean in terms of how you're seeing your customers behave and how they approach? What is the new normal?
I'm not sure what it is, and it's become a phrase we all wish we could ban as well, hasn't it? I think there's so many things that are now normal for us, and one of those is the unpredictability of retail. So, pre-pandemic, you knew that people shopped on the way home on the bus. You knew that lunchtime would be busy Monday to Friday. You knew that people went into stores on Saturday morning in families or in gangs of friends. All of that's changed. You can't predict when people are going to shop. The impact of social media, the impact of an advert, the impact of product placement on Love Island has been the thing that now causes change and causes us to try and predict and understand where peaks are in what we do. So I think the unpredictability is the new norm, that we have to be prepared for the unknown, and no longer, the never events that we all said will never happen, all happened in 3 years, didn't they? So now we're in a place where we're having to prepare to be the best to come out of the next never event that happens, rather than assuming they can go on the corporate risk register and we can kind of shrug our shoulders at them. So it's the change at a business level for me is be prepared a little bit more than we ever have been before for something we just don't know what's around the corner.
And Simon, same question to you. Is there anything that you would describe as the new normal for companies that as they're coming out of all the shock of the pandemic, things that obviously some things are going back to normal, but some things are not? How would you describe the most what the new normal might be?
Yes, Geoff. Well, I think we've touched on a few of them already in our discussion, but I think creating the workforce of tomorrow today would be something that I would be very focused on. Deanna will have a view on that, of course. But, we look at the tight labour market today, but actually beyond it being a tight labour market is a real tight skills market. What are the skills that we'll need tomorrow as we recreate our businesses? How do we raise the digital metabolism of our workforce to be able to do the things that will be necessary in our reorganized business models? So I think it's leaning in, it's moving, doing it nearly right, but doing it now, but creating the skills in our workforce that we will need to be relevant and on the front end of our own businesses and in our markets over the next few years.
Thank you very much for that. Turning to another question. We do have a few more minutes left. Sorry, I misspoke a bit earlier. We do have a few minutes left, so please do keep sending in your questions if you have them. Dimitris, I'm going to send this question to you, if I may. It's one of our audiences is asking about the ESG issues and just how ESG compliant you should really need to be when managing energy consumption, particularly as we're moving to things like the metaverse and 5G. How are companies going to manage that kind of challenge? What would be your advice to them on that?
I think it's a crucial measure that right now is systemically tracked with the purpose of progressively reducing. No? There are typical sectors where to rely in a renewable source or to have the conviction that you are able to sustain all your necessities to renewal is complicated, mainly when you are in isolated areas. For example, we announced a couple of weeks ago a portable renewal unit using a standard container that is able to be rapidly deployed all over the world in order to guarantee that we are reducing the time that we need in order to set up a construction site. We have right now around 1,000 construction sites all over the world, but at the same time, trying to guarantee that at least 60% of the energy required in a construction site is generated in those areas where I'm right now probably in Helsinki. During the winter, that's not going to be efficient relying in solar panel, but in many other places, that's going to be a reality, no? Everybody's having more than ever very, very in mind that the necessity to adopt on a daily basis, not in the long-term commitment, actions that will reduce the energy footprint from the perspective of the consumption and from the perspective of adopting from the storage, from the renewal, from different type of machines, method and automation, modular construction. It's critical, no? And the government, we are working massively in a B2G environment, are much more sensible. It's not a global balance sensibility. We are seeing that Europe is leading that. US is more sensible that couple of years ago. It's becoming a necessity all over the world, yeah.
Another question we have on the whole question of hiring in this kind of market. One for you again, Deanna. What sort of, when you're looking to bring in people in senior management positions in a company like yours, what sort of qualities are you looking for when you're looking for someone who's able to kind of cope with all these different changes and disruptive forces that you're seeing around? And how is that changing over time? What kind of the different things you would look for in people you're bringing in that maybe wasn't the case 5 years ago or 10 years ago?
Yeah, and I don't know that it was all that different 5 or 10 years ago. I think the cycles have created sort of an enhanced pace, right? So when we say managing an ambiguity, right, it is the comfort level with saying things are always going to be changing and moving, right? So definitely the managing an ambiguity, but I think the scenario planning and the ability for people to think through multiple future pathways and how quickly they would pivot or move, and specific examples of where they've done that in the past. The other thing, Simon was talking about, the importance of communication, and I think, sort of transparency and authenticity in a leader, their ability to really connect with the workforce and, create that calm in the midst of that disruption and uncertainty. So I think, that is another thing that I would say maybe wasn't as prevalent previously, and not just sort of communication internally, but I think also that external presence. We've talked a lot at Baker in the last year about the leader as a brand, right? So the positioning that a leader has in the external environment, across social media or any of those types of things, actually having a huge impact on the comfort level internally and externally with how leaders are in this moment. But managing multiple complex scenarios. The panel, the group was just talking about sustainability. That's another one where you're adding another layer into, I'm managing, sort of the cost and, margins for the business. I'm managing the safety of the people around me. I need to make sure that I'm developing the workforce, that I'm, delivering, technologies and differentiating with customers. And then you add on top of that, and I need to make sure that I'm doing it in a sustainable environment. So their ability to put together a multifaceted team and to feel comfortable managing, I would say, in more of a flat project-oriented versus a hierarchical environment, but still, clearly making decisions. So, I think all of that, that collaborative nature of a leader is something that has really, really changed, working in the horizontal as well as in the vertical.
I'm afraid we'll run out of time, I'm afraid. So that's going to be the end of our panel. But if I could ask you, please, to thank our speakers today, Dimitris Bountolos, Richard Corbridge, Deanna Jones, and Simon Freakley, and to thank Alix Partners, our partner for this event. And thank you all to you for spending this time with us. And I hope you enjoyed the session. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.